So this is a presentation about unit planning, but not about the process of unit planning, but more about the conceptual or kind of philosophical underpinnings to planning a unit. So this all started because after a class a couple weeks ago, a couple of students met with me and asked me this question: why bother planning a unit? I mean, after all, isn't a unit just comprised of lessons? So should I, and I know what the lessons need to be because I have standards documents or documentation from my school, or common sense tells me what should be in a unit. So why would I bother planning a unit? Isn't the basic kind of component of teaching a lesson plan? And so it's kind of spurred me to think this through. We had a brief conversation about it, but to make it more permanent. So why bother planning unit? So the first thing is it allows you to clarify what is fundamental about that unit. So I showed this this concept map. This is a concept map for probably a living environment unit on genetics, and somebody has laid out the concepts and the relationships between the concepts, and we can kind of see that there's a flow from Mendelian genetics to sexual reproduction to the introduction of the notion of a gene and the chromosomal basis of inheritance. So very straightforward. It clearly includes many of the key concepts, and that's one approach to determining what's fundamental. Taking the concepts and organizing them either by using a concept map or something else in ways that make sense to the instructor, right? Obviously, what we do is informed by what we think the students, where our students are at, but at the unit planning is really a tool for the instructor to clarify what's fundamental. But I want to offer an alternative to this, which is, so this is a concept map that I put together on my own. So this is not finished, as you could easily see. But I started to really deal with what are the fundamental concepts about genetics. And so if you'll see, there's a question, how to live in things, pass along instructions for how to live to their offspring. That what we're talking about in terms of how to live is all represented by traits. Traits either increase or decrease the likelihood of survival, and so that is a connection to fundamental concepts in evolution. And then there are a couple of patterns in terms of how traits are passed on. Either organisms make perfect copies of their traits, or they make almost perfect copies, and that's how I have categorized asexual versus sexual reproduction. So is this a full concept map for genetics? No, but it does start to get at what I mean when I say what's fundamental about my approach. So what's fundamental to me is understand that what we're talking about is traits. The traits are related to survival, and that the passing of those traits differs whether I'm talking about organisms that reproduce sexually or asexually. So this may not be how you see genetics, possibly. It may not be how you see the unit that you're designing, but I do want to make the point that one of the key reasons for unit planning is you get a chance to really clarify what's fundamental about what you are planning to teach. Second thing, and I think that this is obvious, but sometimes I'm not sure. So teaching, at least for me, and for a lot of other people, but certainly for me, is not about pushing a pile of content across the table from me to my students. So, if I was teaching a unit in chemistry about atomic structure, there's all kinds of concepts. Nucleus, electrons, proton, neutron, electron, subatomic particles, valence, atomic weight, atomic number. There's all kinds of things. And if learning happened through the accumulation of concepts, then by all means identify a set of concepts and push them over to the students. But it turns out research tells us over and over again that that is not at all how people learn. some people learn that way, but almost nobody does, and not many of our students do. So, and again, here's the chemistry vocabulary. So if learning worked that way, all I would have to do is provide my students with this vocabulary and the definitions. Or maybe I'm a little bit more clever and I have them look up the definitions. But even if they knew and understood the definitions of all 22 of these terms, I would argue they may not actually understand what is fundamental about the portions of chemistry that this vocabulary is designed to address. So, I argue, and I'm not the only one, but I'm making the argument that learning is actually the development of a network. It's a network of concepts and their relationships to another. So, and this is represented really well in this particular concept map, where you can kind of see, that it's driven by a number of questions, that the questions then generate certain relationships, and those relationships are complex, right? So something doesn't live in a silo, it lives connected to other things. And so one of the opportunities of a unit is to kind of develop those networks of ideas and then to bring students into that network. So that's another opportunity of building a unit plan. Okay. The third kind of principle for me about why plan units is that people remember and internalize experiences and not concepts. So again, this is a simple thing to prove, which is if people remembered concepts, all they'd have to do is kind of stand in front of a room and read a number of concepts, or more efficiently, give people a book that has concepts in it, even concepts in pictures, and if that's how learning really happened productively, then teachers should go out of business and we should all write textbooks. But we know from our experience as learners and from our experience as students that that's not what happens. But what does happen is that people remember, they remember and they respond to powerful experiences. So in class, I use the example of, if I were introducing students to that concept of digestion for the first time, one of the things I might do is to take food and put it into a plastic bag, and as I'm talking, crush the plastic bag with my hands and invite the students to notice and to share about what they're experiencing. Well, what they're experiencing is something very big becoming very small, and that is a fundamental enduring understanding, as McTighe and Wiggins would say, about digestion. So units, I'm arguing, can be a sequence of experiences and not just a sequence of concepts. So I point this out because when I taught living environment in the homeostasis unit, I was talking about macromolecules, and you'll see down at the bottom this visualizing molecules lab. And what happened in that lab is students made models of simple molecules, oxygen, water, carbon dioxide, and then they used their models to act out first photosynthesis, and this included, so laying out the most simple version of that, but then also kind of looking at what are the key components of the glucose molecule and how do carbon dioxide and water in the presence of sunlight transform into that molecule. And then they also then in turn acted out cellular respiration, where they combine glucose with oxygen and release energy and carbon dioxide. So different than seeing the equation in a book or reading about it or looking up the vocabulary, they had an actual experience of acting out, almost like you might with puppets, this thing. And I found that it greatly increased their understanding and their learning and their remembering, so their retention of these concepts. Okay. The next piece about the answer to the question is why unit planning is, if I know where I want to go, I can get there many different ways and even let the students take me there. So one of the things that commonly happens in classrooms is the teacher has worked out a fairly rigid pathway to go from point A to point B. And so when students ask questions that seem to be off topic, we say things like, okay, that doesn't really, we're not going to deal with that now, or we're going to deal with that later, or something like that. And if it's not unlike navigating. So if I know where I'm going, I can get there multiple different ways. There's an interesting phenomenon when we navigate via GPS, and I have found this to be the case several times, and maybe you have too, which is I'm going somewhere for the first time and I use GPS. When I go there the second time, I still have to use GPS because I've learned to follow the instructions, but I haven't learned where I am in space, so I can't easily navigate from where I am to where I want to go. And I want to contrast that with in the old days of using paper maps, where I would work out a route. The process of working out the route was a way of learning, where I was in relationship to the other place, and so there were multiple ways that I could get there. I would soon learn. And that's the argument that I make. So here's a picture of a map, and if you remember, and this is a picture of Oz, remember in The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy's pathway to see the wizard is constantly changing based on the conversation she's having with people. So rather than having this fixed, she knows where she wants to go, but her ultimate route is formed by the relationship she forms with people as she goes. And that's kind of the point I want to make. The last benefit for me of doing unit planning is that lessons can then be exploited from units rather than units being a collection of lessons. And again, this just emphasizes the points that I've been making, which is I've determined what's fundamental. I've determined that there are multiple ways to get there. I've orchestrated within my unit a series of experience with students have. Now I'm realizing all those in lessons, as opposed to kind of the mathematical formula of I do this lesson, I do this lesson, I do this lesson, I do this lesson, and then they all add up to a unit. That is true on one level, obviously, but the doing the work up front to design the unit, to include the kind of experiences we're talking about, to include multiple pathways, to include multiple means of presentation and representation, gives us a lot more flexibility and therefore allows us to more easily adapt to the needs of the students than if we just taught lesson after lesson after lesson. And I made the point about, so I made that point before. Okay, so if you have questions, you could send them to me, but in the meantime, I hope that this was helpful, and I look forward to seeing what happens next.